in the complex and looking at the book and seeing all the different types of talks. And I'm most excited by so many people of color that are leading organizations and leading thought sessions at Rooting DC. I mean, you guys should be really proud. I serve as Community Engagement Manager at Ginter Botanical Garden. Today, I can't remember what I told him I was going to talk about, but we're going to talk about transforming the built environment through a lens of racial equity. Probably a lot about urban greening. We'll talk about building community capacity, and I hope to cover a couple steps of how to engage this work through a racial equity lens. And then if I land this properly with just the right amount of time, you know, maybe I can give you some insights on how to get some money to do the work. I mean, that's be hopeful, right? You don't want to be so optimistic. Again, I serve as Community Engagement Manager at this place, Ginter Botanical Garden, but my story does not start there. I've been an activist, advocate since I was 21 years old. I'm 39, so all of my adult life I've been engaging in conversations and work around cultural identity for people of African ancestry, holistic health and wellness, poverty, food policy, and most concurrently, urban agriculture. I've been digging into this work in some way, shape, form, or fashion, and just being fluid. But right now, I get to work at one of the whitest places in the city of Richmond, Ginter Botanical Garden. It's a 50-acre botanical garden, very monochromatic in leadership and attendance, much like many other botanical gardens all across the country. I just went, was it Thursday? We were at the National Arboretum, U.S. National Arboretum, and amazing dialogue with staff there as they wrestle with how do they become more inclusive in their attendance, leadership, programming, and etc. So maybe that's a jewel or a tip that there's collaborations waiting to happen at the National Arboretum and as well as the U.S. Botanical Garden. But anyway, Ginter is like 30 years old, 36 years old. It was founded by a guy, it was founded by a group of Garden Club of Virginia people, but the guy's name, Ginter. Ginter is a mogul from the 1800s. He was a Confederate major. He was a businessman. He made his money off of cigarettes, right? So, you know, I mean, come on, we're in Richmond, Virginia, tobacco, right? So back in the day when cigarettes got sold, they sold them by, you know, the single, or you could buy 2 or 3 cigarettes at a time. And they wrap it in a piece of paper, and that was the transaction. Well, the guy, Ginter, comes up with the idea of putting a piece of cardboard with illustrations on it, and hence becomes the pack of cigarettes, right? Makes millions of dollars. Of course, you know, he didn't pay the blacks any money to, you know, grow and harvest the tobacco. But he made millions of dollars, development of different parts of town. There's a really famous hotel in Richmond called the Jefferson. It's one of the landmarks of the city, so famous. He was so rich that not only did he build the Jefferson Hotel, but he owned the brick company that made the Jefferson. So, you know, just to give you an idea of how oligarchy works, Ginter Botanical Garden, Ginter passes his wealth on to his niece, a woman named Grace Arndt, who is a businesswoman in her own right. She's also a social philanthropist. She's suffragist and puts money into different parts of town to create kindergartens, libraries, put plumbing in different neighborhoods or whatever. So fast forward, 1984, Garden Clubs of Virginia, they were pretty white organizations too. You know, all across the country, garden clubs are predominantly white institutions. There's a whole conversation about how the garden clubs, these really white, women-led organizations, really founded a bunch of these botanical gardens all across the country, and how they excluded people of color, women of color specifically, right? But that's a whole nother lecture. But they came together, they said, hey, you know, Grace Arns left this money to create Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden, to create a botanical garden on the property that she used to live and work. And she also left the land, the physical land, to the city of Richmond, right? So her aspiration was that, you know, you're gonna use this money, but you're gonna use this money for it to be a botanical garden. Today, over 450,000 annual visitors, $7.2 million a year, 12 themed gardens, very beautiful place. But it lives in this world of all of these botanical institutions across the continental US wrestling with the idea, or wrestling with the reality, I should say, that they have inherited a legacy of exclusivity, right? Very wealthy spaces, very white spaces, spaces that even though they may not intend to do it today, because of their legacy of how they were founded and who were the people that were attracted to that space as a result of their founding, people of color are pretty much not there or have not been coming there. So Lewis Ginter has been doing this introspection, and in 2016, I was hired as the community engagement coordinator to help the garden expand beyond its walls. The work that I get to do is multifaceted, but I'll get into that in a second. But Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia is a former capital confederacy. 26% poverty, so 1 in 4 people in the city of Richmond live beneath the poverty line. When we disaggregate that data, it looks like something like 43% of the black people in the city of Richmond are beneath the poverty line. In the city is about 50% African American and, you know, give or take 50% white. I mean, there's some smaller categories for Latinx and Asian communities, but it's roughly black and white, right? The poverty of the city of Richmond is concentrated in both the east end of the city and the south side of the city. So there's only 4 sides of town, just like many towns. There's a north side, there's the east end, there's a west end, and south side. So most of the poverty is like concentrated in half of the city. And there's reasons for that, right? We talk about historical trauma in this work. Because I only got less than an hour, we're not going to go all the way back to slavery, but we will say that Richmond was a major slave port, right? And after the end of the transcontinental slave trade, during the intracontinental slave trade, Richmond was the top place for the breeding of people of African ancestry, and their sell down south and out west. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because, you know, that would pretty much be the whole talk if we talked about just the slave trade in Richmond, Virginia. But because I like to bring things to contemporary realities, let's go start in 1950, right? Let's go start with the Fair Housing Act and the New Deal, and we'll talk about redlining, right? So for those that maybe not want to go back the full 400 years, we're just going to go back to my grandma's time and talk about what happened there. So due to redlining, which was the act of the Homeowners Loan Corporation assessing the value of neighborhoods in the city of Richmond, happened everywhere. Just, you know, happened in DC. Every city you find concentrations of African people. When the Homeowners Loan Corporation went through that neighborhood, they took a red marker and colored in where those black neighborhoods were. And that red meant that that neighborhood was ineligible for refinancing of mortgages and could not get, and folks could not, that lived in those areas could not get loans to purchase their home or to purchase a new home, okay? So this phenomenon of redlining was exclusively race-based. White people did not face that same discrimination. They did face a slight form of discrimination. If you lived close to a black community, your neighborhood was graded like a C instead of an F, because the blacks might cross over into your neighborhood. In Richmond, in the east end and the south side, I'll get to a map later, you'll see how the entire areas of that are all red. And we'll talk about how that impacts today. But at Louis Ginter Botanical Garden, as it expanded beyond its walls, and, I got hired in 2016 to try to do two things. A, to steward a collaborative, and this is a key point for those that are taking notes. As we do this work, it's been super important as a predominantly white organization to not step into this work alone, right? The space of collaboration has not only made it easier for this botanical garden to show up in this work, but it also has rooted the work in other spaces. So it's kind of like you plant a tree, right? So you plant a tree, you got your 1 foot wide hole, right? But when you plant the tree, you hope that the roots expand beyond that 1 foot. So as it expands, it's more stable, right? And it goes deep and wide. Same thing with the collaborations, right? So if Louis Ginter stood in that space by itself, it'd be easy to push this effort over. But as soon as I got there, we already had a collaborative called Beautiful RVA. It's basically a collaboration for collective impact of all these different greening organizations in the city. Not just nonprofits, it's also for-profit organizations, individuals, foundations, city departments, as well as county leadership and departments as well. They all have decided to be a part of this multi-sector, interdisciplinary collaborative. So you have people from the Office of Sustainability in the room with the people from the Department of Public Works, and with the foundation, and with activist community in the room with a nonprofit that does green infrastructure. So it's all different types of folks in the space. And Louis Ginter entered in the space as the backbone organization for the collaborative. So when you do collaboratives and things like that, it sounds great when you're like, oh, everybody's collaborating, but who's managing the collaboration, right? Who's sending the emails? Who's scheduling the meetings? Who's ordering the food? Who's keeping the notes? You know what I mean? Who's stewarding the collaborative? And a lot of times organizations that are in that space don't have the staff, so the one that had the most capacity was Louis Ginter. But Louis Ginter was very wise, or I would say very mindful, to be like, hey, we don't want to own this, so we're not going to put our name on it. We're going to create a whole nother brand for the collaborative, right? So Beautiful RVA was born in that spirit. Hired a whole advertising firm, marketing firm, came up with a logo, created a website, all these branding materials. I think I got some stickers with me. And the idea is that people would not think or would not confuse and think that this was Louis Ginter's thing. This is really not. But when I got hired, I was like, well, you're in charge of stewarding the collaborative, which is amazing, right? The second part of this work that I do is the Ginter Urban Garden Program. And this effort is really the spear of the garden's community engagement strategy. The Ginter Urban Garden Program was thought up of in that collaborative space of these folks meeting. Mind you, there was when they first started meeting, it was catalyzed by the garden holding some sort of a talk, like a lecture. Somebody came and they brought all those people together and they said, we're going to keep meeting. So that's another jewel. So if you could find like some luminary, some person of repute that can talk to these issues of equity or what have you, get them to come to your city, have them to attract all the different organizations, and then once you got that core body of people in the room, then you're like, all right, we're going to keep meeting, right? And get everybody on the same page, and then you just quarterly roll something out to keep the conversation going. And in that continuing of the conversation, one thought that came to mind was this phenomenon. How many of y'all ever see corporate group go out into a neighborhood and start a garden, and everybody's all happy, they got their shovels, and the ceilings are planted perfectly, and the soil is just like even on the raised bed, but then 6 months later, it's weeded over. How many of you ever seen that phenomenon? Damn. Every time I ask that question, everybody's seen that phenomenon, so no, we got work to do. So in that room, folks were like, okay, so how do we deal with this? How do we address the fact that communities are being in some ways paternalized, where corporate groups or whomever are coming in and dropping this amazing green infrastructure off with no instructions for the community that's indigenous there, or no buy-in or no ownership from those organizations or for those community residents? What is it that we need to do before that corporate group comes to ensure that people in the community have the skills and the resources necessary to have ownership of those spaces? So we came up with the idea was that we needed to do some sort of community training, and the Ginter Urban Garden program was born. It's a 12-week training teaching sustainable horticulture and agriculture, because I am a botanical garden, so I got to throw the horticulture in there, right? So it's got to be some ornamental and aesthetic stuff. Urban garden design, right? As well as project management and volunteer coordination. These are all skills that are necessary for the stewardship of a green space, right? You gotta know how to at least design it or enhance it as it grows, and you gotta know how to lead a project. What's the budget, right? How do you get the volunteers, and when the volunteers get there, who knows how to break them up into groups of 3 in order to make sure that everything that needs to get done for the day gets done? That's not something that you just walk up on the space and like know how to do. It's something that somebody has to actually like teach you how to do. But most importantly, the thread that runs through all these themes is this idea called community trust building, which is a concept that I gleaned from an organization called Initiatives of Change, where it's really about personal development, but it's a way of engaging conversations about race and class that creates safe spaces for individuals across difference, right? And so, for example, that sounded really wordy, but so in real time, the first workshop of the training program is an explicit discussion about race and concentrated poverty. Before we pick up a shovel, before we talk about seedling, before the word biology is even uttered, it's this redlining stuff. What was the history? What's the stats in terms of Richmond today? What is inclusion, right? What does it mean to be inclusive, right? What is, how do you listen to folks that don't have your same lived experience? I mean, some of us take for granted that we actually know how to listen, but many of us don't. We know how to respond to someone talking and they're giving their ideas, but actually listening. And then third or fourth is how to develop a team so that you can steward this change over time, right? So all that personal development stuff is bundled up into the work. And so instead of it just being a technical program where we're here to teach you these skills, it's also about the personal transformation, the individual transformation. As you know, Michael Jackson says, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. It's required, the work that is required of individuals to do inwardly before they can begin to engage anything externally, right? And then on top of that, we do every Saturday, there's some sort of service learning activity. So everything from edible landscaping, rainwater harvesting, stormwater management, how to build raised beds, how to work a BCS tiller, everything that you can imagine in terms of urban agriculture and urban greening, plant propagation, working in a greenhouse, all types of stuff. So we really try to place emphasis on this classroom time and hands-on stuff. And the meat of this is that this is done through the frame of actually delivering some sort of green space into the community as a result of the training. So every cohort is hyper-locally targeted into a specific neighborhood in the city, right? And then we recruit from that neighborhood and from the city at large. And then when we decide who gets into the class, we're making that decision based off of how many people of color, how many white folks, how many people non-binary, gender identity, you know, who makes over $50,000 a year, who makes less than $20,000 a year, who's a high school dropout, who's a graduate or college, what your occupation is. We're looking at all of these different demographic pieces to make sure that the class is as different as possible, right? So when you come into the class, you're probably going to be in a room with somebody that you probably wouldn't have been in a room with otherwise, unless you were like at DMV. But not that type of close proximity. And we really emphasize like the work of really having hard dialogue. So the type of spaces that we develop are all centered around the community's history and the community's narrative. So every cohort does a community conversation that they are trained for. So the trainees are trained to lead a community conversation, and then they actually lead a community conversation from residents of the neighborhood to identify what type of green space they want to see happen, right? Using their input. This is 6 Mile Zion Baptist Church Community Garden. This is the first project that we did. 6 Mile Zion is important in the conversation about redlining and a conversation about urban renewal, because 6 Mile Zion sits on the border. Well, I don't even know, it's not a border. It's like the church and then the highway. So I-95 bisected black communities across the country, right? Or the interstate highway system in Richmond is I-95. And also it's I-64, so east, west, and north and south. These highways went through black communities. So 6 Mile Zion Baptist, I could stand on the porch of it and spit on a highway. That's how close it was from being torn down. But the community rallied to protect one of the oldest black churches in the city. The actual garden sits on land that was, through eminent domain, took homes away from African American community members. The highway itself displaced over 3,000 homeowners in the city. So when we were digging, you know, planting trees on this property, we're actually putting pickaxe into house foundation, right? So the metaphor of like planting in the hard places is resonant because, you know, as we dig it through, somebody found an old holster from a revolver in the garden. Like, yo, people lived here. There was activity, human activity, but the garden is a commemoration of that trauma, right? So as you go and plant or you're in that space, it's a space of remembrance. And, you know, you always hear the wailing of the highway to remind you of what happened. We'll go through a couple of examples of the spaces that we've done. I don't know how many are in there. I didn't do this last time, but I hope make this quick. This is McDonough Community Garden. This is not the most recent picture, but this is like 30 raised beds. There's now a pergola here and a permeable path that winds through the middle of the garden. Did a project with Sabra, you know, the Hummus Israel. I mean, we're not going to have a conversation about that. They were paying, and you know, folks needed some money, so we hired people from the community to build the garden. So, I will say this: they said that they wanted the garden to be for their employees who did not have access to healthy food, which was fascinating. Because if you're working at a company, you should be thinking about how they get paid. But anyway, really, there's a really nice garden. Oh, really bad there. And we could probably get into that in the question. Let me see. Okay, hold on. There's an emphasis on doing with the community instead of doing for it. That's an important point to note. There's a paradigm shift. This work that we do is not really about charity. This is about, well, it's not about charity at all. It's about how do we build community agency and capacity? How do we move communities from a space of waiting for somebody to do something for them to being able to do for themselves, right? So how do we empower you with the technical assistance and the resources so that you can shift your reality on your own? Really super high emphasis on not owning any projects in community, right? So, you know, branding tells us that as a nonprofit, the more projects that we got, the better we are seen by philanthropy. But we're always on the front to philanthropy. Like, none of these projects are ours. We're working with people in places to support them in their work. And if you fund us to do this work, all we're doing is transferring the funding to these community funds, which is also a part of the racial equity piece and the garden using its privilege to disrupt inequity, right? Since folks only in nonprofit sectors, they like to have a conversation about who has capacity and who has the board developed and all this stuff. Well, Louis Ginter is 30-something years old. He has a $7 million budget. Doesn't really need your grant, but hey, we'll take your money and make it do some amazing things. And corporate folks like to put their stamp on stuff. So that's a whole nother topic. Some more spaces. Harding Street. I just did that. That's a close up. Harding Street, Urbanacc Center. This is before I worked at Louis Ginter. This was an indoor farm that we built in Petersburg, Virginia, through National Institute of Food and Agriculture funding, AFRI. You've heard of USDA and their research grants, right? Okay, so in 2014, Virginia State University School of Agriculture got $3 million to develop a sustainable urban food system in Petersburg, Virginia, and I was the inaugural director. The YMCA was a former USO. It's one of those spaces that was on the Chitlin circuit, so James Brown and Aretha Franklin and Chuck Berry and the greats went through and played and performed here, but they had been closed for a couple of years. And so Virginia State got it and said, okay, we'll turn it into an indoor farm. So what you see here are vertical towers, aquaponics, flood and drain systems, hydroponic spaces, aeroponics, LED lighting, and as well as high pressure sodium light bulbs, like very hot lights. And then on the roof of the building, we put solar on the entire roof of the building to power all the indoor ag stuff. And in the back, we put a commercial kitchen, refrigeration, like 30 by 30 cooler, so that this would really be like a sustainable system. Outside, micro farms, so like a whole vacant lot, just raised beds and rainwater harvesting. Orchards with trees, like I think we planted like 40-something fruit trees. Yeah. And then like vineyard, like grapevine, all in proximity to the space in the heart of Petersburg, Virginia. Literally just like, increasing access to healthy food, but in a different way. Like here we're gonna train people and teach people how to use these alternative systems of growing, but also like culinary arts and value added products and all that type of stuff. So like really like how to create micro food systems within a block by block network. Swallowboro Community Garden, one site that we started. George Wythe Edible Garden, there's a high school I went to, we put a garden in there. Fifth District Mini Farm, this is actually black owned land in Richmond, Virginia on the south side of Richmond, where we've been supporting one of our trainees who came through our program, wanted to start a farm on this back lot. His grandfather used to grow here, and he heard about our program, went through it, and as a result, this is probably about a 1/4 acre of land, but there's a whole nother lot that is owned by a librarian brother. So it's like this collaboration from enslaved, formerly descendant of formerly enslaved African Americans, and now like continental Africans collaborating on land use that's specifically for self-determination for people of color. It's powerful, powerful, powerful work. We do a festival called Highland Natural Day there. Can you give me some water? About that. So look, this is the point where I can jump into. I got 15 more minutes. Okay. All right. So we're gonna fast forward. 6 steps to fostering racial equity, or doing this work through a racial equity lens. Okay. I got 25. Yes. We're doing good. So step 1, for your collaborative or for your group of entities or collaborating partnership organizations that are going to do this work, the first thing you need to do is establish an understanding of what is racial equity. Everybody got to be on the same page about that. If you can't get on the same page about that, it's a wrap. You're not going to go for it, right? So in this case, I showed this example visually to delineate the difference between and from people of African ancestry, that actually centered white folks in getting land. We think about things like the Homestead Act. We think about the Civil War and the promise of 40 acres and a mule, and Andrew Johnson literally turning his back on all the formerly enslaved African people and saying, yo, we're going to give the land back to the folks that seceded from, the United States. And not only that, had a nerve to say that the blacks need to work hard to earn some land. Like, what? Have we not worked for free? I don't know. Anyway, there's a whole great book about this called White Rage, and then also Slavery by Another Name. So understanding racial equity is the first step. We're using the same definitions. What is racial justice? Well, in this case, instead of everybody having to reach for the fruit, what if we extenuated the trees and gave deference to the people that had not had apples for however long? Like, you go first. Since you haven't had apples in 400 years, the folks that have been having apples for 400 years, y'all go to the back of the line. The folks that haven't had it, now they can access it. They don't need no box. They can get it for themselves and move forward, all right? Justice is the hardest one to get to. The equity work is just like the step towards that, but it is not justice, right? Doing equity work is just like, how do we create a culture where people can understand that justice is necessary, okay? I want to make sure I make that delineation. This is McDonough Community Garden. I think we planted like 30 fruit trees here at Community Garden since 2012. It's crazy. It's another site. This is Gilpin Court. It's a public housing community in Richmond, which is the oldest public housing in the city of Richmond. It used to be all Jackson Ward, but then they ran the highway through, and so on one side it became Gilpin Court, and the other side Jackson Ward. But this is a community farm that's now underway as a result of the work that we've been doing. Also, in step one, it's important to understand that there's a lot of intermingling, synergistic, compounding things that are, it's like a knot. You gotta untie the knot. It's like black people or communities of color dealing with internalized racism and classisms, are also interacting with institutional racism and interpersonal racism. White folks are dealing with their own bias and privilege, and then their own fears of being ostracized from other white folks as a result of them being anti-racist. All of this stuff is happening simultaneously. And so, it's important to have spaces where affinity groups can do work, but then there's also spaces where those groups can intermingle and discuss what the hell is happening, as they do this work. It's hard. It's not for the faint of heart. It requires soul searching for folks. And this is, it's real. The second step is engaging and empowering affected populations and stakeholders. So I put this as an equation. Engaging is like, okay, hey, come take my survey, right? Hey, I want to hear what you think, right? Let me do a focus group with you, right? I'll have a community conversation, and I get all these results. I put it all in the white paper. And then the people that were at the actual session never see the white paper again, or never hear back from the folks that surveyed them, right? So that's engaging, right? That's community engagement. But community empowerment is like, okay, we did all this research, we surveyed you, we asked you questions. Now, based on the responses, here are the resources that you need, or here are the things that you said you needed in order to create the reality that you want to create, right? And so this work for us is a combination of both. Engaging that community and at the same time providing resources in order for that community to iterate, its own solution. So we asked the community, what kind of green space do you want? What do you want it to do? What do you want it to look like? They tell us, hey, we want a space for gathering. We want food. We want, beautification. We want something that's gonna, address the stormwater and the urban heat island effect. We're like, okay, all right. So we got trees, we got wood, we got soil, we got plant material, we got shovels. We're gonna need to get all that to you, and we will get all that to you, right? And we will also provide you support and promoting these work days. And do you need website help? Do you need marketing assistance? You know, what else do you need? Think hard. Don't just, give me the first thing that comes up. Really think about the resiliency of the space and how can we support you in making sure it's sustainable. So, yeah, we make sure that the community, at the end of the day, that my work every day is about how do I make sure that the community has taken ownership and leadership. Like, if my success story is that this community garden or urban farm is now more resilient and doesn't need anybody to grant a grant for them, or doesn't need me to give them any more tools, they're good, right? They're set up and they're on the road. Step 3, it's important to gather and analyze the data that has been disaggregated. It's not just data for data's sake. It's how do we break that data down along racial lines, around income lines? How do we break that data down across social indicators so that folks can see what exactly is going on in the community? This allows us to quantify when we're moving the needle and where we need to put the needle in the first place. So in Richmond, Virginia, this map is of the, this is the ERS, USDA, lack of food access map, because we don't say food deficit. This is the green, is the areas that don't have access to healthy food. As we move past getting the data that's been disaggregated, we got to start asking questions. So step 4 is conducting systems analysis of the root causes of the inequity. All right. So nonprofits are very good at putting band-aids on bullet wounds, right? So how do we go into community and be like, yo, son, he needs, not only does he need stitches, but we need to figure out how to stop the gun violence that's happening. So what's at the root of it? Why are these inequities in existence, right? So, some questions you can ask. What institutions are involved? What unfair policies or practices have been in place that created the inequity? One of the questions that I like to ask is, what norms, what myths or popular ideas justify and maintain the problem? So we're at a food conference. So everybody likes to say, oh, well, the blacks, they just don't like to eat when, the grocery store doesn't work in the neighborhood. It's because that they don't, they like soul food and chitlins and stuff. And that's crazy, right? Black people like to eat healthy too. Maybe it is because it's too expensive, right? Or maybe it's a transit issue, right? Or maybe it's not the culturally relevant food for that community, right? There's so many other factors. But the first one that the myth goes to is that, oh, the grocery store is here, the black people not going there, that must mean that they don't like to eat healthy. You want to get a question? No, I didn't. I was
What was the job?
The jobs?
It's the jobs that black people had. Like,
right.
I applied to a job in Wisconsin, I still haven't heard nothing back.
There you go.
And I know somebody that applied one time, and we got the same background. They heard something back the same day.
Right. So, thank you for that. So it's all these different things that are happening at the same time. So, doing that systems analysis, trying to figure out the root cause makes your work radical, and sometimes philanthropy don't really like that. And I'm sorry to say, that's the work that we have to be engaging philanthropy on, to say, hey, we're tired of putting a Band-Aid on the bullet wound. We want to get to the root causes. So engaging philanthropy in that conversation means that you got to be brave enough to open up your mouth when they're putting their grant application in front of you, and you be like, hey man, this is great, I like where you're going, but can we get to some deeper things? We need more money to really tackle what's really going on in this community, right? It's not just about this garden that we're starting. This is great, this is a start, but this is deeper than a raised bed. Conducting the systems analysis goes back to the conversation I have about redlining. So this is the HOLC map for Richmond, Virginia, right? So HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, they went across the country and they assessed the community, gave it the grade. So these are the red lines that are indicated when we say redlining. And as you can see, this is the east end of Richmond, and then, you know, because the map, it's not, you can Google it. This, the rest of the map for Southside shows that the predominant spaces. But these red dots, though, are important, because these red dots reflect the concentrations of vacant and blighted properties in the city of Richmond. So look at where they're concentrated. In the same areas that were formerly redlined, right? So when we begin to look at the root causes of the inequity, after we have disaggregated the data, we can see that there are multiple things happening at the same time in these communities of color that are compounding issues, right?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Where is Churchill located?
This is Churchill.
Okay.
This part right here. So step 5, it's important to identify strategies and target resources to address those root causes. And when you're developing those solutions, because this is where you start think tanking, what can I do? If the community that's most affected is not at the table, you need to start over. Okay? This is not a space for you to start brainstorming and thinking about solutions, and the people that are most impacted by these issues are not in the room. In fact, if they are not in the room, you're doing the whole thing wrong, right? After you've gotten all that data and talked about racial equity, and you still ain't got the black folks that or the Latinx community in the room, oh, you missed the point. You know, this is not about you. This is about centering non-white communities. So some of the great questions that I love to ask, what groups are most adversely affected by the current problem do you want to benefit? Let's see. It's another question I like to ask. Or who benefits from there even being a problem? This is often a tough question. This is like, okay, damn, I gotta go and deal with the hospital system, right? And I gotta deal with the government. The municipal government might actually be creating this problem. That means I gotta do some policy changes, and then we gotta have some power struggles. It's real, like who's in charge? But the key words in any equitable strategy are working with and community ownership. And it's prefaced by your authenticity. Everything about this revolves around authenticity. And I would be brave enough to say your vulnerability, because you're gonna get a lot of this wrong, right? It's gonna be mess ups along the way. And being vulnerable enough to say, yo, we were wrong. Like Rudy Rise, y'all were in here a few minutes ago. They were like, yeah, you know, we recognize that it was we, the two white women who founded this effort, were like, yo, we need to stop. We're not supposed to be doing this. Maybe there's somebody else that needs to be in this space. So that form of vulnerability, radical vulnerability, I even would say, is imperative, because it's like white supremacy lives in this space of, I am never wrong, I am the white. Everybody else, even if I'm wrong, I will find a way to make it seem like it's somebody else's fault, right? And creating that type of vulnerability is a space where you can really be human, but that's not what the system is. Anyway, part of the step 5 of reaching to the right strategies is also reading and studying. So, I mean, this is an old slide. There's more books. There's better books to read than these, but these are good ones to start. White Fragility is about confronting your own defense mechanisms that occur when folks bring up racism, right? And then even more so when you're challenged to be anti-racist, like to really think about what does it mean to embody that and to not be afraid of that. That's super important. And then the revolution will not be funded beyond a nonprofit industrial complex. You know, boy, we live in this world where it is literally a system where well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that nonprofits exist to transfer wealth between the wealthy and other wealthy people. Like, we like to think that nonprofits are about social justice, but I was in a room with a retreat from a lady from a foundation, And she was talking to this nonprofit. I'm on the board for the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, which is a land trust in the city of Richmond. So the lady is a foundation head leading this retreat. And she said, it seems like you're leaning towards racial justice. I was like, what? I thought that was the point. so nonprofits, no, it's not necessarily about that. This is like transfer of wealth and usually like transfer of white money to other white-led nonprofits. Not only transferring money, but land and other capital resources. So will it be funded? On the days that I've gotten a new grant and it's big money, I'm like, yes. Philanthropy will solve the problem. Well, on the days I get denied, I'm like, philanthropy, they don't understand, they're racist. And anyway, another book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paula Freire, is a really amazing book that helped me shift, and has helped millions of others shift how they engage communities and the paradigm in which they engage those communities. The idea of the liberation of those who are oppressed having to be exemplified by other oppressed people is one of the most important ideas in the pedagogy of the oppressed. But there's another idea in there that talks about the oppressor being locked in chains herself as a result of the oppressing that is being done. That actually creates a prison for the oppressor who can't be human. And because he is or her are actively in the act of dehumanizing someone else, right? And I think that's such a resonant idea. Is like, how do these systems, institutional systems, prop up people of non-white ancestry and make the suffering of non-white people, like, there's a gap between understanding what's happening. So as a result of that gap, it's like you can't even really empathize, right, of what's going on because of the disparity. But those are 3 books just to get you started. There's way more. Like I said, White Rage is a really good book. I just started reading that. And then there's this book called The History of White Trash. There's another book, The History of White People. Those books really help break down what whiteness is, and we really have to start inspecting that. Like, I think like it's only been in the last 5-10 years that we've really started to examine what is whiteness and how have we interpreted whiteness and the othering of everybody else. Like, there's whiteness and then everybody else. Like, how do we need to start deconstructing. Step 6 is to and so this is the fun part, is where you just you come up with an idea, you put it into place, track the results, you look at your progress, and then you revise your strategy. Because really all of this work is iterative in its nature. And when I say iterative, I say, nobody has solved racism, right? Where? Is there somebody that solved the problems of racism in the built environment? Has they ever? Since there is no one that has done that, we're all trying to figure this shit out. We're like making it up as we go along. And we're learning from our mistakes, and we're learning from others who have made mistakes, and we're progressing accordingly.
When you said that, I see a lot of young children, and how young children that I've seen interact with other people and don't see that concept,
right,
don't know that concept. It's kind of interesting to think about, like, how as adults we condition
the children into these social, We can have a conversation after. When I was a kid, I lived in Hanau, Germany. When I was a small child, I lived in Washington State. And then we moved, I lived in Seattle, and then we moved to Hanau, Germany. So all my adolescence was there. And I can tell you, this is facts. I mean, I didn't know what race was in my up until like I'm 10, 12, I didn't really understand it. But then when I moved back to Richmond, Virginia, and I'm like, holy, this is where it's like, oh, there's only one white kid on the bus. They picking on him, and then on the flip side, like my neighborhood looked like my neighborhood, but other parts of the city look amazing, and it's racial stuff. And as I got older, understand that. So yes, the conditioning is a part of it. But there's also structural inequities that these kids are growing up into. So this is really the point of all this, is how do we create equity across communities, so everybody has access to the amazingness of life, right? And they don't have to come up and feel inferior because of where they live, or have a chip on their shoulder, or be broken by the system as a result of the color of their skin. I don't know how much time I got left, but another name for the work that I've been intoning this is giving props to Emmanuel Pratt from out of Sweetwater in Chicago. Really calling this regenerative placemaking, right? Because really all we're doing is we're taking plants and putting them into the built environment and transforming the built environment so that it's more biophilic or has more green infrastructure. But that social justice sits at the heart of this. And that essentially our work is not just food access. It's also environmental justice. It's also climate resiliency. It's also community organizing. It's also stormwater management. It's also urban heat island effect. It's like all these things at the same time. And depending on the funder, we might highlight one or the other. but essentially, it's like the practice of being multidimensional, right? We're acting, we're time traveling. We're bringing the past to the present, and at the same time, like we're engaging in multi-levels of our liberty simultaneously. How much time I have? 8 minutes. I'm not gonna do this. So yeah, there's a whole process to regenerative placemaking, and the work that we do follows that. But I'll start here. I'll stop here. Part of this work is also giving acknowledgement to our indigenous ancestry. Permaculture is a hot topic for regenerative farming now, but it's important to recognize that indigenous agriculture is a thing, that indigenous communities were not just like tribes sparsed out around North America, that these were cities, civilizations, and nations with intensive crop production techniques that people now call permaculture. But, David Hallberg and Toby Hemingway, they got their ideas from sifting through indigenous land use strategies, right? And, Bill Mollison and all of them, they observed indigenous Australians. And, what if we gave them credit is my conversation. And so looking at this work of transforming the built environment through a lens of permaculture is very, I think, advanced level stuff, but it does provide us some sort of a framework in how we can be more equitable, not only with the people that we engage in on a social level, but also, which is ironic, because I hardly ever run into black permaculturalists, but I see a lot of white ones, which is bizarre because the conversation about permaculture has a social component. But I don't know, that's another lecture too. We'll just leave that there. But all these ideas sound amazing, but I just never really see the permaculturists really practicing on the social level, right? So if we can lift that conversation up for communities of color to embody these things, it would be amazing. And then I'll leave it with a quote from George Washington Carver, the father of regenerative agriculture, decades before Rodale, planting nuts and beans for nitrogen fixers and composting and so much fascinating stuff I probably could do. There's a brother in the vending space now that has a whole thing dedicated to George Washington Carver. Start where you are with what you have. Make something of it and never be satisfied. That's just, we'll stop there and go into questions.
Thank you for being here. You had a lot of really excellent slides that I took pictures of. Very informative. I wanted to offer another book recommendation.
Go for it.
I had a chance to see Cornel West speak a few years ago and meet him. And he talked about how Moby Dick is a book about white supremacy. And I was like, so I read it through that lens and realized he's right. The whole book is symbolism. So it's probably the first book ever written about white identity and white supremacy before we had those terms. So check it out. Written in 1850 by Herman Melville. Moby Dick is a book about white supremacy.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
No problem.
Right. seeing that Trump is in office, he'll probably get in office again. The Democrats look real weak. And that systemic racism has been part of this society for like 450 years, and even going back 2,000 years. Start looking at Europe's march into this mess that we're in now. Do you really think that, I mean, we're doing great work. I just came in and I'm actually got a permaculture design certificate and, you know, all the, you know, I'm a horticulturalist and a tree expert here in Maryland. But I'm just really thinking, you know, we're kind of preaching to the choir here. The average white person, every time a black person says it, they're pulling the black card. You know, they're saying, now, why are you bringing up that? That was a long time ago. Well, we still suffer from the repercussions and the ramifications of being enslaved. When me and you get pulled over by the police, you know how it is.
Yes, sir.
When a white person gets pulled over, unless you're in Kentucky and you look like a meth head, you get treated differently.
Right.
So my question is, in your experience, and yeah, I just came in when you were talking about Germany, because I've been to Germany and I found it very racist.
Yeah, right. And I'm talking about it when I was like
Okay.
a kid. No,
Yeah,
I'm
okay,
sorry.
well, maybe,
Sorry.
yeah, maybe you weren't since that. Do you really feel like it's even viable, other than just putting a Band-Aid on it, and as black people, respecting the red indigenous people here, right? So we can make this distinction, even though we know our ancient ancestors came here too, before Columbus, that we should just start looking at Africa. Because Europe is looking at Africa, and so are the Indians and Chinese. So why stay somewhere that we're not even welcomed? Because this is one of the white homelands, like Australia, like New Zealand, the U.S. and Canada, and there's probably another country in there, South Africa. So I'm just thinking, in your experience as a black man,
Yeah.
why even really try to? I mean, we should do something, but maybe we should be funneling our resources like the Jews do to Israel, because they see that as their homeland. So anyway, go right here.
That's a very complicated, well, I'll say this. It's definitely important for people of color, for African people, to be thinking about how they can go back to Africa and engage in a working with instead of a doing for mentality on the continent, right? Because a lot of us go back to Africa as tourists, and we engage kind of like we're white folks in Africa. And so there's a whole conversation about that needs to be dealt with. So yes, we should be going back to Africa and developing and working in the same ways that we are trying to develop communities here. Should be doing it across the pond. I feel like I can't answer all your questions, but I can say that I feel like racism is white people's problem. I feel like it's white people's problem being imposed upon black and brown people, and that in order for it to stop, that it requires white folks to be brave enough to challenge other white people about about the policies that exist and the past history. Most white folks don't have a clue about American history. Reality is, if I went to the same school as you, chances are they didn't cover any of what, I had to learn in my adult years about the Civil War, Andrew Johnson, redlining, Jim Crow, sharecropping, all that stuff. I had to learn it on my own. So if I had to learn it on my own, I know you had to learn it on your own, because we read from the same textbooks, unless you went to like an ultra private school or something like that, then maybe you got some other type of curriculum. I don't know. I can't say that. But I will say that learning this information, learning this history, and then challenging other white folks is the role and responsibility of white folks. It's your job to be anti-racist. It's my job it's communities of color's job to develop their communities, but at the same time, white folks got a job too. And I can't put all the burden on the shoulder. 400 years of oppression as a black person. It's like, yo, I didn't do this. I was born into this, and I'm born into this hierarchy. I need those who were born into the hierarchy on another level to challenge it and upend it with me, right?
I wanted to say, like, I don't have a question. I wanted to say, like, how I look at racism and stuff. I look at it like, everybody is racist to everybody. Everybody be racist to everybody. Everybody treat everybody wrong in some type of way. And, like, it shouldn't be like that. And I feel as though we shouldn't pay attention to what happened in the past. but to what's happening in the present, because we're here now.